This is our quick review. I'm not going to read through all that, but this is where we've been going through in Scripture so far. So that left-hand column is basically Genesis, and then where we've gone since then. So we've gone through all of Exodus. That gets us to Mount Sinai. The Wandering is essentially the last 3 books of the Torah, of the Pentateuch. So Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And now we're at the book of Joshua. And I'm kind of calling that Priest at the Crossroads, and maybe you'll figure out why. I did want to, since I wasn't here to talk about wandering, one of the big things about wandering is that, like, when God takes the people from Egypt into the desert, he's gotten the people out of Egypt, and he takes them to desert to get Egypt out of his people. So there's this attitude, there's this just sense of abundance that exists in Egypt, and God doesn't want his people to be that way anymore. He wants them to be sustained by his word, so that he wants them to be a people of the ear, a people who hear God's voice and follow him, and that's what sustains them. I'm not preaching that message tonight, though, so let's move on to Joshua. Joshua is an interesting book, and we're going to take this really quick zoom flyby, like 10,000, 30,000 look at the entire book of Joshua right now with the highlights. So it starts off with this big speech from Joshua to the people of Israel where he's told, first God tells him to be strong and courageous. He tells the people as they go through the camp to be strong and courageous, and then the people come back and say, Joshua, we're behind you, we're going to follow you, but we want you to be strong and courageous. And so that's a big part that repeats. We'll talk more about that. Then they go, and the first city they come upon is Jericho. And so this is the scene in Jericho featuring Rahab, where the spies are hidden and stuff, so this is just the spies in Jericho. And then all the rest of the people have to come into that promised land area, so they have to cross the Jordan. But at this point in time, the Jordan's this crazy huge river that's in flood stage. So God actually stops up the river, much like he does the Red Sea, and they go across on dry land. We take some stones out of that and set those up and say, like, this is to remind us that we made it through the Jordan. And then they actually get to Jericho and they take the city, and that's when they do the whole marching around 6 times, blowing trumpets, and then the 7th time they march around 7 times, blow trumpets, the walls fall down, they go and they take the city. The next city they managed to capture is I think it's called Ai or I don't know exactly how you pronounce it, but it's spelled Ai. So initially, the first time they try to attack the city, they fail, because God said, when you take Jericho, don't take any of the sacred objects. And there was this guy named Achan who took some of the sacred objects, but he didn't tell anybody, and he hid him in his tent. And so the first time they try to attack Ai, they fail. They are defeated. They're routed. And they were like, what the heck? Like, God said he was going to give us this city. And then God says, well, there's this guy that took some stuff. And then they found out it was Achan, and crazy stuff happens. Anyway, they end up being able to capture Ai because they do this, like, super awesome military move where they, like, send in a group. And then, like, that group starts retreating, and then all the people in Ai are like, oh, good, we're going to rout them like we did before. All follow, and then there's this whole other group that just sweeps into the city and then sets the city on fire. And then all the troops are like, our city's on fire. This is not good. And then they come back, and then they just get, like, stormed in the middle, and it's huge military defeat. Anyway, so they're starting to capture all of these cities. And so some of the people groups are just talking about how this isn't good. What do we do with this? So there's this group called the Gibeonites. They're actually kind of like the next group in line that Israel would just mow through if they're allowed to continue. Instead, the Gibeonites disguise themselves and put on these really ragged clothes and pack their bags full of, like, moldy, disgusting bread. And they make it look like they've been journeying for a long time. And they come to the Israelites and say, we're people from far away. We've heard about your greatness. We've come to make a treaty with you. And Israel says, okay, well, God's promised all of the land in, like, this general vicinity, but if you guys are from far enough away, sure, we can make a treaty with you. We won't attack you. And the Gibeonites are like, awesome, let's sign that treaty. And then they find out, like, a couple days later, oh, those were the people that, like, we're supposed to invade next, but now we've got this treaty with them. And then they do this crazy thing, and they continue to honor that treaty, even though the Gibeonites totally deceived them. And then, so the Amorites are kind of the whole general people group that live in Canaan, and so they're kind of tired of getting pushed around by the Israelites and this group that's just come in and is kicking them all out of their homes, kind of fed up with that. So 5 of the kings of the Amorites band together and create this huge army, and then God has the sun stand still so that Israel can defeat them in battle. And it's this crazy moment, sun standing still. That doesn't happen, in case you didn't know that. And then at the very end of Joshua, as Joshua is kind of like near the end of his life, about to retire from being general, he gives this big speech about choose this day whom you will serve to the Israelites to say, listen, it's been really good while I've been in command, but there's going to be people that come after me, and you got to continue every day to say, we choose to serve God. We choose to follow God. So are you going to do that? And then Israel's like, yeah, sure, we'll do that. And then, Israel doesn't do that. But anyway, so that's the big picture of Joshua. And then what we get into with Joshua then is, let's see. Okay, this is good. What we see with Joshua is that there's all this conquest going on. And there's people being routed, and there's entire cities being eliminated, being destroyed. All the men, all the women, all the children, all the livestock, it even says in many of those cities, is completely destroyed. And that seems excessive a bit. Some would call it genocide and probably wouldn't be inaccurate using that word because it's a different people group that the Israelites are eliminating here. And Israel has come into their homelands that they've had for centuries, many generations. This has been their home, and Israel's driving them out. And hopefully, if you guys have been tracking with me when we've been talking about Scripture so far, that's not the picture that we have of God. He's not a God that does this. He's a God that saves people. He's a God that redeems. So we're going to talk a lot about why is this conquest happening? What's the deal? What's an explanation for this? But first, I wanted to remind you of this verse that I brought up 2 weeks ago. This is when God and Moses on Mount Sinai, and God's passing by Moses. And God says of himself, Yahweh the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy, I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. I lavish unfailing love to 1,000 generations. I forgive iniquity, rebellion, and sin, but I do not excuse the guilty. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children and grandchildren. The entire family is affected, even children in the 3rd and 4th generations. And the words there that hopefully stick out to us are the generations things. For those that God loves, he spreads that love to 1,000 generations. And for those that are guilty, the punishment goes to the 3rd and 4th generations. So again, 1,000 generations of love, 3 generations for punishment. So that's a really uneven ratio in favor of God's unfailing, incredible love. 1,000 to 4. Okay. Fun fact, by the way, 1,000 generations, like from the time of Moses until now, we haven't hit 1,000 generations yet, in case you're wondering about that time span. That'd be like 80,000 years, which we are not at yet between us and Moses. So if you had great ancestors that were like Moses, then God still loves your family. Isn't that cool? Okay. Anyway, so why this conquest? Why is this going on? Why are the inhabitants of Canaan being wiped out? Let's get right. So here's a couple perspectives on this conquest narrative. That's the general term I'm going to use for God commanding the Israelites to go through Canaan and to conquest. Conquest narrative. So one possible perspective, you'd maybe call it a justification, is that it didn't actually happen, or at the very least, it's been heavily embellished. And there's some good historical reasons for this. For one, archaeologists have been digging up a lot in Israel and the surrounding areas because there's just a lot of history that's happened there. There's really few records of this time frame. We kind of know where Jericho is, but Jericho's a city that's been built up and then destroyed and built up and destroyed and built up and destroyed a bunch of times. And most cities in that area are. So it's really hard to tell exactly when they were destroyed or what groups did it or what's the background, unless somebody just happened to keep really good records. But we don't have a lot of records about this happening besides the Bible. And so a lot of archaeologists are starting to say, well, maybe it didn't happen. Or maybe it just didn't happen on the scale that the Israelites tell of it happening within the text of Joshua. Because one thing that happens with history is history is written by the winners. And winners, a lot of times, like to embellish their victories. So this next picture it's called a stela. It's these big stone tablets that people would erect anytime that they conquered an area or something, and they'd write on it about their conquests and the amazing things that they did. These two are both from a guy known as Sennacherib. He's an Assyrian overlord king guy. We haven't met him yet. He comes along later, but he actually shows up in the biblical narrative with the king Hezekiah. And the reason I bring that up is because on this particular one where you see him on his throne, he talks about how he trapped Hezekiah in a siege of Jerusalem, and they completely routed their armies. And the funny thing is, if you read the biblical account of that, yes, Hezekiah got trapped, and then God sent a plague that went through all the Sennacherib's armies, and then they ran away with their tail between their legs because they couldn't defeat Israel, even though they had Jerusalem under siege for a long time, and they had Hezekiah trapped. So obviously those accounts are different, and they're written by different groups. Assyria is eventually the winner over the Israelites, and they do defeat them. It just takes a little bit longer. So they're the ones writing the history that we recognize, and they're embellishing the victories because that's what people tend to do. They tell their fish stories, It's like, I caught it, it was this big. I had to let it go, so there's no evidence, but it was totally this big. They do that with war, too, and so just saying all the people they conquered. So that's a justification that people will use. Well, maybe Israel did work through this area, but maybe the conquest wasn't nearly as crazy as they say. Maybe they didn't kill every single person and every single animal that they came across. That's a justification. I'm not trying to give any particular weight to any of these to say, I think this is the truth. I'm just laying out possibilities here. So just so that's clear. Okay, number 2. God doesn't actually directly command this slaughter of people at any point in time. So there's an interesting thing that happens, that this angel shows up when Joshua is about to take over Jericho and send the troops in there. And the angel kind of gives him those instructions of like, this is how you're going to do it, and this is what's going to happen. And really, we're just not given as much throughout the rest of Joshua of any time where God shows up directly or an angel from God and says, go destroy these people. We do have Joshua continuously over and over again saying, the Lord has given us this land. The Lord says to go do this. The Lord says to go destroy. But we don't have places in Joshua where that's backed up with God visiting Joshua. That doesn't mean that the message wasn't from God. It's just that if you just stick strictly with the text, you actually, the only place you see God commanding the armies to go in and destroy a city is Jericho, the very first one. Now, maybe the author thought he had set a precedent and he didn't need to report any of the rest of the times that it happened, or maybe it just didn't happen again, and Joshua said, God wants to give us this land, so we're just always going to follow the game plan he gave us with Jericho, which is to wipe out everything. So who knows? Maybe Joshua was overzealous. So this is the instructions right before this as they're going around Jericho. In Joshua 6, 16, and 17, it says, the 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. So there's a footnote there for devoted, where it says it's a Hebrew term that refers to the irrevocable giving over of things or persons to the Lord. Another term for that would be consecrated, which is a Hebrew word that we've seen before, as God consecrates his people, sets them apart to be holy. The weird thing about this is there's kind of only 2 different ways to consecrate things to God. You give it to him and you like buy it back from God and you redeem it for money. Or if it's something that's unclean, you kill it, and that's how you give it to God. Now, this is usually talking about animals that are like your firstborn and your animal sacrifices. If it's an unclean animal, you're supposed to just kill it, and that's your way of consecrating it and giving it to God. So what happens here is the Israelites hear the word consecrate, and that's really the only information they're given as to what they're supposed to do to Jericho and to most of the other cities. That's the word that's most often used for destroy in Joshua, is the word consecrate. But they go, well, these are unclean pagan peoples. So the only way to consecrate something that is unclean is to kill it, is to completely destroy it, completely wipe it out. And I know it sounds like a lot to lay just at the feet of like a mistranslation, miscommunication, that like if God really didn't want them to completely destroy something, he'd like come down and be like, hey guys, like consecrate actually means set apart and made holy. So I would like you to, I don't know, convert these people and make them into my people, and then they would be holy like you are holy because I consecrated you and I didn't kill you, I made you holy. But God never does that in Joshua. So again, throwing out possibilities. All right, so that's that thing. So yeah, just think maybe pagans, maybe not unclean the way that the Israelites thought they were. Okay, number 3, God meets cultures where they are and works to move humanity forward. I guess I'll dip my toe in a little bit and say this might be my favorite explanation, defense, because we see this through the life of Jesus, where Jesus came to live amongst us in order for us to understand better God's love and his forgiveness and grace and those kind of things. And Jesus modeled those things for us. So God enters into culture in order to move humanity forward so they have a better cultural understanding of the way that's supposed to be, of what it means to be God's people, what it looks like. And he does this continually with Israel. And so some of the ways that we see this in Joshua is that Joshua himself, he does a lot of things like other conquesting kings of that era and area would have done, where in the time when he defeats the 5 Amorite kings, he goes and he takes all of their heads and puts them up on pikes to display them outside of the city, which was it's just a common thing for conquering kings to do, is basically say, look at what I did, I just beat these dudes, haha. But then Joshua does something really weird, that by nightfall, he tells his troops to take them down and to bury them properly. And conquesting kings don't do that. They leave them up as a display until they rot and fall off, or the wild animals eat them up. You don't bury the bodies of the enemies that you've defeated. You mock them mercilessly, even though they're dead. But Joshua doesn't stoop to that level. He doesn't mock. He does celebrate his victory in many of the ways, but he draws a line where most of those kings of that era did not draw their line. So he's not quite at this, I hate using the word advanced because I feel like we do too much judgment of culture comparing it to ours and saying like, we're so much better than other old cultures because we're better and more advanced. And anyway, but whatever. Joshua's not quite at this maybe level that he should be, that God's working through him, but it's different. And there's the treaty with the Gibeonites that happens. They were deceived in making a treaty, and Israel is obviously the higher power at this point in time, which is why the Gibeonites come like groveling basically and say, please sign this treaty with us, don't defeat us. They deceive Israel to sign this treaty. Any other person that enters into a treaty, especially with someone that is lesser than them, and find out that they were deceived, immediately they're going to tear up that treaty and they're going to wipe that people group out, or they're going to enslave them completely or do something really terrible to them in response for the fact that they were lied to enter into a peace treaty. But Israel says, you deceived us, but we're going to honor your treaty. And we're going to do what we said because we're going to keep our word. Because God's commanded us to be people who keep their word. And so we see other places in Joshua that the stories that end up rising to the surface, the ones that stick out the most, are these redemption stories. It's the story of Rahab. It's that story of protecting the Gibeonites. It's stories of these impressive, unexpected victories over these massive armies that band together to try to defeat Israel. And Israel is able to, because of the miraculous power of God, win under insurmountable odds. So it's these redemption stories that tend to be the ones that are magnified in Joshua, the ones that you end up paying the most attention to. And actually, Joshua 11:19. So there's a theory that all of Joshua is actually a giant chiasm. It's been a couple weeks since I've mentioned a chiasm, but that's the thing where there's like repetition, and it all points to the very center of the text. And in the center, there's this cool buried treasure that happens. And so it's just a way the ancient writers would use to like try to bury extra information within a text. And so there's a theory that the center of Joshua, of the book, is this verse, which is really weird to have as your buried treasure. But it says, except for the Hivites living in Gibeon, not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites, who took them all in battle. If you buy into the chiasm theory, that seems to say maybe there was some more going on with that peace treaty than at first meets the eye. And maybe there was more opportunities for other nations to enter into peace treaties, but they decided, no, we're going to fight against Israel, and we're going to take our chances with that. So maybe there's more going on with that peace treaty thing with what's happening in the culture. So there's all of those things. The final point, or perspective, I should say, is that the Amorites, the residents of Canaan, were straight up evil. I think we've got some pictures coming up. Yeah. All right. This is the part that's going to be tough for me to get through. So the Amorites, one of their main gods was Ashtoreth, who is a fertility cult goddess. So that means they had shrine prostitutes. And they had all these practices that related to sex. There's actually, one of the things that happened is if you were a husband and your wife got pregnant, in order to ensure the birth of a healthy child, you're supposed to go to the shrine prostitute and be with her for a week after you've impregnated your wife. And that's standard practice. Most shrine prostitutes, it depends on their religion and the views. Some of them had immense power as priestesses. Some of them were just sex slaves, and that's all. And they were just there to be objects to be used for religious purposes. So that's the first aspect. Fertility worship, bad stuff. The next slide's worse. Because they're one of those religions that believes in child sacrifice. And so for most common people, the first kid that they have was offered to the god. This is a statue of Baal that's also a furnace. And you see the glowing arms of the god. And that's where they put the baby. All right. I don't want to look at that anymore. I was hoping to be able to move off of that quickly. Oh, okay. So the Amorites weren't a great group of people. There's a verse in Genesis in 15:16 where God is talking to Abraham, and he's telling him about the promised land. And one of the things that he instructs him is, you're not going to take that promised land right away, because the Amorites have not yet reached the full portion of their sin. And God says it's going to be another 4 generations until your people are going to come in and take this land back. And so I think you can make a pretty solid argument for God saying it's been enough. Enough babies have died. Enough women have been oppressed. Enough is enough. And my people are going to come in and they're going to tear it all down, because there shouldn't be a trace of any of this left. The problem about that explanation is then you get to that other difficult question of, God, why did you wait so long? And that's one of those things that gets really difficult for us to judge. Because we have God's incredible mercy that keeps giving generation after generation after generation of wicked people the chance to turn around and to follow him and to do something good with their lives. And we also have the God that knows when to say enough and sends in his people to tear it down. It says this stops now. And I want to say, I don't even want that happening to one baby. But I also don't want an entire group of people wiped out because they have this false religion and they don't know any better. And so I don't know where to draw the line. And thankfully, I don't make that decision. So that's some of the possibilities. Let's get into the message of Joshua, because there's more going on than just the conquest. And I think there's more for us to take out of the text than just being confused as to why this conquest happened or why God drew the line where he drew the line. One of the messages of Joshua is location. So let's put up a map, because maps are fun when you talk about location. So this is Israel, and we've got Egypt. We've got some desert there. We've got these major nations of Assyria, Persia, Babylon. Greece is up over there. Rome is up over there. Israel, if you notice how the land kind of narrows, and Sinai is this big desert. Israel is desert-y, but not nearly as bad as Sinai. And it's a pretty darn good place for traders to have a trade route through. And essentially, in the Eastern world, the Israel is the crossroads of the world. It's where everybody converges. It's where all those cultures, all those societies intermix, because they're all sending traders right through that strip of land in Israel. And so God says, I want my people to be at the center of it all. And he picks the one spot on the map that's the very middle of the ancient civilization because he's already told them, you're to be my priesthood to all nations. And you know where a really good spot to put the priesthood is? The middle. We even see this in Exodus when God tells them to build the tabernacle, and he says, put it in the middle of the camp and have your priests in the middle so everybody can observe what they're doing and know what it means to be a priest. And that's what you as my people are supposed to be. And then he sends his entire people and says, you go right in the middle of everything and be my priests there. All right, what's another theme we get from Joshua? We get this idea of standing stones. And so I talked about it as they crossed the Jordan. What they did is they pulled these 12 rocks out of the Jordan River, one for each tribe, and they set them up. These are not those rocks. These are another set of standing stones. And actually, they're not Jewish at all. They're pagan standing stones because a lot of ancient peoples did standing stones. It's a common thing back then. But what it does is it puts a big, giant reminder to everyone that something important happened here. Kind of like those stelas, but standing stones are a little bit different because standing stones require a people to tell the story again of what they did, what they accomplished. And so whenever the later ancestors will see those standing stones, they'll turn and say, Grandpa, what happened here? Why are these rocks sitting upright? That's not how rocks sit. And you say, well, our people crossed the Jordan. God made the water stand still, and we walked across on dry land. And that's how we knew that God had given us this land to be our home, to be our promised land for us to live in and raise you guys. And so Joshua reminds us that we're supposed to be telling the stories of our life, of our faith, the things that have happened that have marked our journey. So we have standing stones in Joshua. Another thing we have, is chazak. Oh, the Hebrew. Okay, the Hebrew got that's weird. I tried to do the Hebrew word there at first, and then I got transposed second because software does weird things to Hebrew. But that's fine. Chazak ve'hamatz is probably how that's pronounced. I'm not good at Hebrew. But it's that be strong and courageous refrain that's repeated over and over again, especially at the beginning of Joshua. We see 1:6-9, be strong and courageous because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. So that's what God says to Joshua. Joshua then takes that word, sends it out to the entire encampment of the Israelites, who come back to him and say, Joshua, we're going to follow you like we followed Moses, which should be ironic to you because they did not follow Moses very well, but that's okay. They say, we're going to follow you like we followed Moses. We're going to follow you like the way we're supposed to, but we want you to be strong and courageous. And they say this phrase over and over again, one to another. And it reminds us, and I think what this conquest narrative, why it says that they went out and they won these incredible victories, and sometimes in incredible ways where they're blowing trumpets and walls are falling down and they're walking across flooded rivers and they're wiping out cities when the numbers are always against them, is that if we band together as the people of God and we are strong and courageous and we support one another in our community, that God will do miraculous things in our lives. He will win us miraculous victories that we have, fights that we have no right even being in. God will win for us. And so they use that conquest narrative to further this story of that we are a people of God and God fights for us. And that is our God. We should be strong and courageous. So we've got Israel that's been given this land in the middle of all the action, in the middle of a collision of all kinds of cultures, where they are to serve as priests, where they are to bless all nations, which is the calling that was given to Abraham right at the beginning of a lot of this stuff, or earlier on in all this stuff. And so I think what we should be taking from that is that's what God still is doing today with his church, with his people. That we are to be a people that are in the middle of the action. We're not to be some holy huddle that keeps ourselves safe and apart from everything else that's going on. We're not supposed to run away from issues, from disagreements in culture, from clashes, from anything. That we are to represent God in the place where we are put. And one of the cool things, if you maybe haven't noticed about our campus and many college campuses in America, is that we are a place where the nations have come. We've got a huge international student population here on our campus. I don't have the numbers right now. A whole lot of Chinese students, that's our biggest one. Indian is pretty good size. You gonna help me out, Elizabeth? Or?
Yeah, there's 2,000 students from China, and then there's like 900 and something from India.
Yeah.
Korea and...
Okay, cool. So this is a place where the nations have come to our doorstep. And we're right here as a ministry, right in the middle of it. And we get to see these cultures interacting with one another. The cool thing is God hasn't commanded us to go and consecrate people, and we don't have to try to interpret that and be confused and think we're supposed to wipe people out. We're not doing that. God's told us to love people. We've got that from Jesus. So he's given us a game plan that we can run forward with, that we're supposed to love, that we're supposed to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. That's from Matthew 28, Great Commission, in case you don't know. And those are our marching orders. That's what we're supposed to go out and do, is love and tell people about Jesus. And we've been put in an amazing spot to do that, to reach all nations just by walking around campus. That's pretty cool. That's pretty exciting. And I think if we stick together, if we support one another, if we remind each other that we are to be strong and courageous in God, that God can help win us some pretty incredible victories. Even when we think that nobody wants to listen to Christians anymore, that everyone thinks that we're hateful, bigoted, mean people, that God can really show amazing ways that his love can shine through, and we can make a huge impact on this campus. And so my encouragement to you from Joshua is to be strong and courageous, to trust the place that God has put you to be, to serve him, to do his will, to listen, to be people of the ears, listen to his word, and let that sustain you.